Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this HIAF webinar on the new National Housing Federation Code of Governance. Paul Bailey from the National Housing Federation has kindly agreed to join us today and go through a presentation on the new code and then answer any questions you might have on the question and answer session at the end. And you can type your questions using the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen, or you can also put your hand up at the end. Paul has worked for the National Housing Federation for 10 years and has been working on governance briefs since 2016. He was originally an engineer who moved into engineering regulation and then into the National Housing Federation. Paul's worked as an IT project manager, working with international teams to create online services and associated back office enterprise systems. He's also a qualified risk manager and an independent member of a housing association audit and risk committee. So perfect skills to meet our requirements today as internal auditors ourselves. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Paul for him to take us through his slides. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks very much, Helen. Well, I don't know whether I'm perfect or not, but hopefully I'll be able to give you a bit of a flavour of the Code of Governance. Oh, hello, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen now, and hopefully you can all hear me. Helen, can you hear?
Yes, I can, yeah.
Oh, brilliant. There we go.
Sorry, it took us a while to take my mute off.
Yeah. Yes, and thank you for that introduction. I hopefully I am the right person, but certainly there we go. So hopefully you can now see a screen. Right, so without further ado, so I'm Paul Bailey, Head of Governance and Compliance at the National Housing Federation. As I say, today I'm going to be talking about the 2020 Code of Governance. Hopefully in this session I'll be able to give you a bit of an overview of the new code, talk about the rationale behind it, why a new code and why now, talk about some of the key differences between old and new codes. But certainly I won't be able to get into all of the detail, but hopefully I'll be able to point you to some resources which will be useful for you after this webinar. I'm also going to try and talk a little bit about the changes which may impact internal audit teams, for you, and I'll also talk about the code's links to other things such as the Federation's together with Tenant initiative and the Social Housing White Paper. But before I get into any of that, I sort of want to take us back to this: why do we have a code of governance? And let me take you back to 1992. We had George Bush Sr. As President of the United States. The Cold War was ending. With Camp David, they were signing agreement with Boris Yeltsin. Isaac Asimov died. Selena Gomez was born, and sitting at the top of the charts was Whitney Houston with Sing Along If You Like at Home. Anyway, enough of that. So that's where we were back in the 90s. But in the world of corporate governance, things weren't so rosy. We'd had the BCCI scandal. We had Asl Nadir, Polly Peck siphoning off money and then moving to Cyprus for many years. And we had Robert Maxwell, again, using pension funds money to shore up the Mirror Group. And off the back of all this, the Cadbury Committee was set up. And I'll let you Adrian Cadbury chaired it to look into corporate governance. I'll let him explain why.
We were set up specifically to look at this issue of corporate failure and the apparent inability of the annual reports and accounts of companies that failed to state the true position as regards their financial affairs.
And so after the Cadbury report was released and many of its recommendations adopted by large companies, Cadbury then went on to say he was very pleased that around 2/3 of the FTSE 250 now had audit committees in place. To put that in context, that 66% did have them, or to look at it another way, 80 FTSE 250 companies, roughly 80 FTSE 250s didn't have an audit committee. And just to, again, what's the size of a FTSE 250 company? Well, when I sort of first put this slide together some time ago, Kia Group was down the bottom of the FTSE 250 with a £4 billion turnover. By comparison, Clarion's turnover is a mere 800 million odd. So that's the scale, really. And now I think we'd be surprised to find even some very small housing associations without audit committees. So the world of corporate governance has moved on a lot. So that's where we were, and now we're in a very different place. But enough of the sort of history in the background. What I want to also talk about now really is get onto the NHF code. Many of you will be familiar with the 2015 code at the moment. There it is in all its glory. And it sets out clear requirements for housing governance. Lots of you will probably have used the checklist and gone through it to confirm whether compliance with it. And it does carry legal weight due to the Section 198 of the Housing Regeneration Act that gives the regulator powers. The regulator then has its governance and financial viability standard, which says an organisation must adopt and comply with an appropriate code of governance. And one thing I probably should also say as well, we're very keen to have the regulator on board when we were revising the code of governance. The regulator sat on the advisory group because one of the things we didn't want them to come out with at the end was them to not deem a revised code of governance appropriate. That would not have been helpful for its adoption across the sector at all. So that's why we're adopting code, but what are the drivers for the change? Well, back in 2018, we had the Social Housing Green Paper, and a lot has happened since 2015 when the previous code was published. We've had deregulation, housing associations themselves are taking on different risks. The shape of the sector is changing. Also, there was the Grenfell tragedy, the focus on residents and health and safety has obviously changed. And there was also the changes in the wider world of governance. We had a new charity code, we had a new sports code, we had a new UK corporate code. So it took in sort of, as the landscape was changing for governance, it was time for us to update the code. We also, I've got together with Tenants logo up there as well. We had our initiative to work more with tenants as well. And now, of course, we've got the social housing white paper, which I'll talk a little bit about a bit later on. So when we rewrote the code, we started off with a very open consultation, talking about the principles, talking to as many people as we could in the sector and beyond, the stakeholders as well. Publicised that as far and wide as we could, and then we took all of those responses, and we had an enormous amount of responses from that initial consultation. Over 60,000 words of narrative was given to us, and so some poor person had to go through all of that in our research team. We then put together a panel of experts for the collaborative drafting process, and then we did a final consultation on the draft code. So that's what we did to get to it. So moving on to the actual code itself, it's got a new structure. It's based around 4 principles as opposed to the previous 8. We're trying to make it a simpler document and one that's more accessible for boards in particular. The previous 2015 code, it starts off, section 1's all about compliance. It says you shall comply with this code and make a report on it, etc., etc. And although that's still in the 2020 code, it's been reframed to make it something which is, if it's picked up by a board member, the first thing it's talking about is strategy and mission and values and leadership, as opposed to compliance, to try and make it something that appeals more to the board member, something that people don't instantly just say, well, that's for company secretaries, that's for the technical people, that's for the auditors to look at. It's not really something I want to get into the detail on. And that's also a reason why we separated out the guidance. Previously, we published guidance together with the code, whereas now we've thinned the code down and published it on its own. There's new content in it. Emphasis on accountability to residents and other customers. It was in the 2015 code as a one-liner, and it's now much more prominent right at the start of the 2020 code. In terms of compliance with it, for lots of organisations, it probably won't be as much of a challenge as you might have thought. Lots of the things that the code talks about are happening already across many organisations, but they're now being brought into focus in the code. Equality, diversity, inclusion, EDI issues is now specific rather than implicit across the code. Health and safety has been brought in again right at the beginning with explicit requirements. ESG issues, the environment, again, that's coming in, and culture, reputation and trust as well. So those are sort of the new things. So I'm going to talk through the principles a bit more in detail in a minute. It does also seek to stretch organisations a little bit. And I'd say one thing, the code of governance isn't like, this is it. You can go beyond it. You can do different things. It is a document for to start from, but it's not the be all and end all in many ways. And it is a challenge because there's one code for the whole sector. We want it to be flexible as possible to work for someone all across the sector, for small organisations to large organisations, those in group structures, those without group structures, and so that's a challenge. It's still based on the comply or explain approach as well, so there really is an option to explain if for some reason elements of the code do not work for organisations, although it's rare to see it. And it is, as I say, it's not a governance handbook. So to put that in context, I sort of would say, if you think about the code of governance, there it is, it sits there, but it sits in a wider matrix. There's the law, there's the organisation's rules, there's the SORP, there's the code of conduct, there's standing orders of a housing association, and there's all of regulation as well. So it can't do everything, and it's just one piece of the puzzle. So going on to the code itself and looking at those principles. And by the way, just as we go through, if you've got any questions or anything, do type them into the chat as we're going, and we can pick them up at the end. I can't actually see the questions at the moment, so do think of them as you go along. So the first principle, all about mission and values. The new thing was bringing in this sort of accountability to residents being an explicit requirement. Within the guidance, we strongly suggest adopting the Together with Tenants Charter is a way of doing this, but it isn't mandated. We don't mandate that. Again, health and safety coming in explicitly. Bringing in the workforce as well, that's mirroring what was happening over in the UK Corporate Code. So when the FRC, Financial Reporting Council, revised that, They brought in requirements to deal with consulting with the workforce, and at the time there was a lot of these things are always a product of their time in some ways. There was a lot of talk around the gig economy, etc. When they were doing that, and we have brought not all of that over, but a nod to it within the 2020 code. Again, EDI came across very much in all the consultation we did there. It's important to the sector, so it's been brought in with more explicit requirements into the code. Again, culture being something that was also being brought in, and the culture piece, I think, is one of the challenging areas. In terms of it's in the UK Corporate Code, and some of you may or may not have seen it, but Grant Thornton do a review of how well people are doing complying with the UK Corporate Code. They go through all the annual reports of the FTSE 250. And the culture piece is the hardest, but it is in there because, as I say, we wanted this to be a stretching thing. But it may also probably be one of the more challenging areas, perhaps if you are trying to do some testing as an internal auditor, as to what exactly you can test. So I'm sorry about that, but it is in there to try and make boards think about things. Because one thing I think with the code of governance, what we try and make it is a mirror to an organisation. They can hold it up again and look at themselves, and sometimes they may not want to see certain things. So the code's sort of forcing people to look at things which they may or may not. And as always with these things, and this is the thing, sort of some of the prescriptive elements of the code. Later on, we'll talk about stress testing as a specific requirement to do some stress testing in there, which is very, very specific, and sector specific. But all the organisations that are working well are doing that anyway. It's in there to make sure that those who may not be doing it are going to do it, and forces them to see it written down that they should be doing something like that. Again, accountability. Requirements coming in this first principle, and for those who've looked at the social housing white paper, which I'll talk about a bit later, a lot of these things are mirrored in that as well. So by looking at the 2020 Code of Governance, organisations will be hopefully in a good position to deal with that. The second principle is all about strategy and delivery. Again, we're bringing in, ESG here, working with others being a thing that came out of some of the work we did with the Great Places Group, which is another federation initiative, felt to be important. But we did tone that down from one of the drafts. Again, workforce. And group structures and joint ventures, again, that's coming in here now. Some more explicit requirements to say, look through the group and try and use the same code, but recognising that is not always possible. Principle 3, we then start to talk about board effectiveness more here. So, organisations doing their job well. This area, the second one here, requirement that people with direct lived experience or particular insight into the communities served by an organisation are meaningfully engaged in governance structures. When we originally drafted this up, we said represented as opposed to meaningfully engaged. And I think we changed this to try and get away from the idea of people being representatives of entire groups of people, because no one tenant can be a representative of the entire tenants of an organisation, even in some of the smallest housing associations. And so we changed that and put more flexibility in. But the principle behind it is again, it's very much this focus about trying to make sure that you do engage people in a meaningful way, and that may actually not be to have loads of people voted in to be part of formal governance structures, but that there are lines of communication between residents, tenants, customers, those stakeholders and the organisation, which hopefully will break down some of the barriers to some of the challenges which I think we face in different ways across the sector. We start to talk about roles of a bit more of board members here in this section, but it's all was there in the 2015 code as well. Board review, learning, appraisals. So it's not going to be. It's just such a challenge for everyone who looks to adopt it. This is probably one of the most controversial ones that I get many emails about it, or have had a few. The change to board tenure to be 6 years down from 9 years. In the 2010 code, in the guidance, we advised 6 years, and because it was in the guidance, everyone just did 9 years, or quite a lot of people did. And so we've now brought into the code the idea of 6 years being the norm, and then boards have to think about things if they want individuals to go on for longer. It is still possible. It is not against the code for individuals to be there for 9 years. One thing I would say is for organisations that they do not. It would be probably a negative thing to suddenly look at your board and say, we've got too many people on here who are coming up to their 9 years. We need to have a cull. That's certainly not what we were attempting to do here, but it was to try and make boards focus on the idea of their renewal and making sure that they are still fit for purpose and have the right skills mix. Because 9 years actually is an incredibly long time in some ways. If you think about where we were as a sector 9 years ago versus now, and you think, would the individual who was right for an organisation at one point still be right going down the line? But it would be aspirational to move to it. As opposed to a sudden change where everyone is on 6 years. So moving on, the fourth principle, the sort of final bit, we talk about control and assurance here, and again, it's trying to embed the board's role in obtaining robust assurance around the effectiveness of controls, as expanding the content on audit and risk, because I think we very much acknowledge that this where the sector was and where it's moving to and the risks it faces going forward has changed. And some of the language around this, that I think probably, for you particularly as a group of auditors, internal auditors, what is the right level of assurance is a challenging thing for organisations to work out sometimes. And what's right for one is not always right for another. You have to consider, the organisation's capacity to accept risk, its appetite as well for certain risks, and the nature of an organisation. What's right in terms of assurance for a small general needs housing provider would not be right at all for a much larger organisation. We also, at this stage, we're talking about new section, talk about the board's oversight being involved in issues of whistleblowing and confidential concerns. And again, talking again, the audit committees and external auditors side of things will be very familiar to those who use the 2015 code. So that's a sort of a rundown of the code itself. It very fast, but I did want to leave some time to talk a bit more about different pieces as we go. I also said we're going to talk about the white paper, not in great detail because it is quite a there's a lot in it, and it's not really the focus of today. But again, the white paper brings that charter, brings a charter, 7 commitments that social housing residents should be able to expect from their landlord. And its themes, again, it's sort of building and resident safety, resident voice, transparency, accountability, all of these things come in. We're getting near to pseudo FOI and the code of governance touches on these as well to try and get organisations into a place where hopefully if they adopt the code of governance, what comes out of the white paper will also be easier to comply with. There's also talking about social landlords reporting. And that's one of the things. There's a lot more about reporting and openness and information and transparency within the code than there was in the 2015 iteration. Again, it's where we're moving as the sector. So just to look at the charter. I'm not going to read through all of these, but about safety, about performance of your landlord, to have your voice heard. All of these things are reflected in the code, or at least those ones are very much explicitly. We don't go into talking about the quality of the home and neighbourhood, but you could say some of the culture and values pieces and mission would also touch on that. But as I say, I don't want to say too much about the white paper, but it does. I think the code lines up quite nicely with it, and that's hopefully that was a happy accident in some ways, because we didn't actually know what was in the white paper, although obviously we very much knew what was important to the sector when we were drafting the code. I think it showed that we had the right people around the table, that group of 20-odd external experts that we brought together to form our advisory group were the right people. But anyway, so from an internal audit perspective, I wanted to sort of say, well, what sort of talked all about code and where it's come from and why we have it. But sort of like, you'll think, what about us? If organisations, our organisations choose to adopt it, or those that we're auditing, what's going to happen? So I think the first thing is, and probably many people round the table have already done this gap analysis, and look at where the gaps are between the code and what you're doing now. I think that's the start, and that will help organisations understand what they've got to do. I'll talk a little bit about some of the resources we've got to support that as well in a minute. The focus for each organisation will be different. it's obvious, but it will be, you know, depending on what is important to your audit committees and boards, where they, you know, we're seeking what levels of assurance they seek at different elements will be different, and it will depend on all sorts of factors. There are the requirements, you know, to have, and in some places publish certain information. As I said, there's a lot more of that, and I'll talk about that again in a minute. But I will also say, just because the code has increased its emphasis on something doesn't mean that the sort of work you're doing needs to necessarily change, because the code reflects, I think, you know, some of the best practice in the sector. So, or we've certainly tried to make it that way, and that's there to. So an organisation may already be doing more than required to, you know, meet the code requirements, and you know, it doesn't necessarily mean we would need even further assurances and more audit work around some of these elements. That it's, you know, things are already happening. I would again, you know, emphasise lots of detail is in the guidance. It is a new code, so, you know, how exactly to best practice in its implementation will be something which will come out. You know, I certainly not saying that I've got all the answers by any means at all, but with that guidance, we tried to focus on areas where there are new things coming out. So we're putting, you know, we've put more emphasis around, you know, what to do, you know, around, say, the culture piece, as opposed to, you know, making a statement in your annual financial statements. And I would also highlight, though, that the guidance is not an approved code of practice. It is guidance. You don't have to do things in there in the way it suggests, but it's there to try and give people, especially those who, you know, smaller organisations as well, ways of how to adopt the code in a proportionate way that works for them. So going more with guidance, as I say, it's got lots of links about other bits of good practice. There's a bit about culture in the from the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors, I think, that we linked to, and some of you are probably already familiar with that document. If not, check that out. We still have a compliance checklist. You know, that's something we want to avoid tick box governance, but there is a checklist still. So separate sections for smaller organisations going over the 4 principles, and the transition period as well. I just wanted to sort of say a little bit about this. You know, lots of organisations may be keen to adopt the new code, the 2020 code, and say, right, we're going to adopt it from, you know, 1st of April reporting period, and we wouldn't expect everyone to be immediately fully compliant with everything within the code at that juncture. I think it's for time for the period of the year to look to get to a point where you know, you can report compliance towards the end of the year. For some organisations, it will be more work than others, depending on where they're coming from. But certainly, sort of a pragmatic view is that you know, if you choose to adopt it, you aren't having your feet held to the flames immediately on compliance with it, and hopefully that will, you know, giving yourself some time would be positive in the run up to, you know, looking at when you are actually compliant. There's also, as I've spoken a lot about, you know, new documents, things that need to be reported to people or published, etc. There's tables throughout that guidance which list all of those to make things easier rather than, you know, having to go through it. So hopefully useful tools. And to say the compliance checklist has been updated as well, so there's a new 2020 compliance checklist. So, as I say, adopting the code, I've already talked about the gap analysis, but a gap analysis would be a way to start. Then a paper to the board to adopt it. Some of you probably already were past all of this, and then a statement in the next annual report around it. Also, I'd like to just talk a bit about some of the other resources that there are and just highlight them. In the new code, there's a glossary, it's a new section, so it defines things like regularly, things like this, what is regular. So we've suggested that regularly should be once every 3 years, but for some things it's definitely going to be more frequent than that. But it is up to each organisation to work it out. As I say, the guidance, we've got more guidance than we've ever produced. I'd say there's more things on our website, webinars from the authors over at Camp Kell, who we worked with. For those who've been to the conferences, they can still access them online. There's still other meetings. And we also have the governance forum, which is online, which anyone can join. And there's a whole archive of questions and things on there, and people sharing best practice. So for those who are really keen, there's more there. So that's a sort of a quick run through the code and some of the things that I sort of wanted to highlight to you. I hope you've found it useful. You can get the code itself and the guidance from our website, and you can contact myself or my colleague Sarah with further questions. At this juncture, I think I may stop sharing my screen so I can look at some questions. And I don't know if, hopefully there's other people are still there. Oh, hang on.
I think they are.
Yes. Oh, good. I'm just not shouting into the void.
We have got one question that's come through on the Q&A, and that's from Kath, and that's regarding something you've just touched on there. Around the 2021 accounts and what you need to put in there, and it's whether you need to disclose if there's any particular areas of non-compliance actually in the accounts.
So it's the same approach as the previous 2015 code, comply or explain. So it is so if you say were to be doing the accounts for 2020 to 2021, i.e. the financial year we're just about to end on, well, you'd have adopted the 2015 code probably, and because you didn't have the option to, unless you decide to change it last week. So for the financial year we're just about to finish, you'll be doing it against the 2015 code. For the 2021 to 22 is the period we'd sort of expect people to adopt it for. And as I say, at the start of that, there will be areas of non-compliance, but it's when you get to the end that we'd envisage you doing the check against the compliance with the code. And so if you need to be compliant by the end of the next financial year, not immediately at the start. Hopefully that answers your question. I think I've written it in the guidance in perhaps a clearer way.
Yeah, I think it was just kind of the extent to which you would need to say how much you were non-compliant if you hadn't been compliant for the full year.
Yeah, and this is tricky, isn't it? I mean, what is compliance? How much assurance, etc. do you need around these things? And I think for each organisation, they've got to work that for themselves. So some areas are very prescriptive. If you've done board appraisals or not. But whether they were any good, well, who knows? And so there's always the challenge, isn't it? As I say, it's You know, it's, as I say, the code's like a mirror. Hold it up to an organisation. It forces you to do something, but it won't make organisation that could be, you know, not doing so well better at all. Oh, I can see another question come in.
Yeah. So that's around principle 3 on the board effectiveness, and whether sort of the stuff it mentions around composition and roles, and whether it then goes into outcomes.
Does it go into outcomes? Nearly. It talks about you know, setting and ensuring compliance with values and vision, you know, mission and strategic objectives of the organisation. It doesn't go into specific outcomes, but it is yes. I think yeah, I'm just thinking about it. It probably it's getting there, but it's not saying, you know, you shall you know, be at this point many times. There are a few areas where, you know, it talks about things like, you know, each committee having a formally recorded terms of reference that's approved by the board, etc. You know, which is quite specific and easy to test against. But yes, David's got something he'd like to add to this. It seems, is that right, David?
I think he's just saying that Professor Ridley has a question. He's got his hand raised to ask a question.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. Do you want to ask a question, Professor Ridley? Is Professor Ridley on mute?
Can we unmute Geoffrey Ridley?
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes.
Yes, we can now.
You can hear me now, Paul. Paul,
Yes, I can
I'm
hear
very
you.
interested.
Lovely to speak to you again.
Pardon?
Lovely to hear from you again.
Yeah, I'm very interested in the views of the NHF on the role of the senior board member. You said you'd benchmarked against other codes of governance in the development of the code, but in both the National Health Service and in listed companies, the senior independent board member is a requirement, and you've opted out of that.
We have, yes. So, you know, roles and responsibilities. So we do talk. We talk about senior, as I say, senior independent director there, and the vice chair. And I think it was something where, and I know you personally would be, you know, very much the advocate of saying, you know, you should have a senior independent director, and we're seeing it more. But overall, the feedback that we got was that it was potentially going a little bit too far for the sector, which I think it. As always, these things are, I suppose, an element of compromise, and we could have put it in as an element to stretch people to put in, you know, to have a SID, to have a senior independent director, unless you had no good reason not to. But I think the thing is, I suppose, the majority of the sector is there are still a lot of small organisations out there who I think would have found it an additional burden to have the SID. But as I say, it's not, you know, it's not a you know, a code where it's you know, just because it doesn't mandate it, you shouldn't consider having a senior independent director. and in reality, I think it's started to talk about it, and maybe in the next iteration we'll see a change in that part. But certainly, if you feel that it would be a useful role to add to your board, then we certainly wouldn't discourage it.
I understand that, but it just seemed to be a bit sort of, if it's a requirement in other sectors, why do you see it as just an option in the housing, social housing sector? That's my feeling. I mean, it's not. I mean, the NHS, of course, do require it, and so do and have done for a long time, and so do the listed companies since 1992. And yet you've opted out of this. It just seemed to be a little odd that that you've missed it. You've missed the opportunity in this code. I believe that eventually you will adopt it in time, but it just hasn't been adopted this time. I mean, it is growing. There are a number of housing associations which are adopting the appointment of a senior independent director.
Yeah, and we get, as I say, we get closer to it. We say there is a dedicated senior board member, normally a vice chair or SID, with duties that include the post of the chair and assistant chair. We're starting to get there, and as I say, I think in some ways I could probably agree with you. We could have gone further. We could have gone further on the SID. We could have probably gone further on some of the ESG side of things. And I think, I suppose the only thing I would say is, one of the things we wanted from the code is that it to be adopted. I think if we made it too scary, there was the danger that people would sit on the 2015 code for longer. And so, as I say, I think you're probably right. In the next iteration, we may see it as something that comes in as a requirement. And I suppose one of the things, and we did consider the idea of having mirroring the charities approach of a code for larger organisations, a code for smaller organisations, potentially then. It would be a lot easier to say, well, for larger organisations, you should have your SID. But ultimately, we didn't take that approach. And I think the reason we didn't take that approach was because even the smallest of housing associations are actually a lot bigger than the, what are the small charities? The charities code is talking about a turnover of less than £1 million. And I think the idea, especially for those stakeholders looking in, of a two-tier approach to governance, where some people who happen to live in housing association homes owned by a smaller organisation that don't have to meet the same standards, we felt wasn't the way forward. But yeah, it is something, and I think I'm sure you will continue to advocate vigorously that everyone should have a senior independent director. And I think it would, what I would say is, although it's not in the code, it would be something that we would advise organisations to strongly look at the case for having someone who performs that role.
Yeah, but it's not just the appointment of the SID, of course, it's the role of the SID in the assessment of the chairman and the appraisal of the chairman, and also there to address concerns by other board members. It's a very important area in board effectiveness, and it just seems to me the opportunity was missed to not include that as a requirement, which would have improved considerably board effectiveness and the opportunity to achieve a high level of effectiveness at board level.
Yeah, and I think, as I say, I accept that it was an area where, you know, I think especially probably this group in particular probably would all appreciate us doing that, but unfortunately, you know, these things are as I say, a compromise in some ways and of their time, and you know, much as you know, potentially maybe if I was writing a code myself, I would be perhaps tempted to, you know, heed your advice. Ultimately, you know, the feedback that we got around it, because I think I can't remember if we did put it in even in one of the drafts, or we certainly discussed it at the advisory group, and it just didn't quite it didn't make it in the end. But as I say, maybe next time. But certainly also we're going to be looking at some of the other things around the code as well. So we'll be looking at the code of conduct, and, you know, potentially when we look at that, it could be something where we again take the opportunity to perhaps emphasise, you know, the importance of, you know, this type of role. I see there's some more questions coming in. Is that right, Helen?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
it is, yeah. Thank you, Professor Whitley.
Yes.
There's a bit of clarification on the previous question around Principle 3, which is around sort of whether there's a need for board to do a self-assessment on how well they work as a board, and whether they meet the challenges of the organisation and the external environment.
Yes, that is. I'm sure that's in there. I don't know exactly how what point it's at, but certainly there's just a little scroll through. Yeah, there's a whole section on board performance review and learning, and I think that's something that was very important to us as well. On the code is to you know, sort of, we've actually, and we've got a book on board member appraisal as well. You know, we were looking at, you know, in the past, I think boards did collective appraisals, you know, and in some ways, you know, where we are now, I think we need to, the code says you should be doing that, but you should be also looking at the individuals as well, especially even if you're in a world of just volunteers, as opposed to you know, paid board members. It's still important to have you know, appraisal process where the effectiveness of the organisation of the board and its subcommittees are looked at and reviewed on a regular basis.
Yeah. Just a question as well, in terms of just something I'd sort of had to think about and spoke to other colleagues about. In terms of the regulator, are there any specific areas that you think they'll have a focus on from the code?
Oh, that's a very good question. Is
there anything they got excited about on the advisory panel?
Yes. So I would caveat it saying I would not want to speak for the regulator.
Yeah,
but I think the regulators sort of focus. You know, there's bits that are coming in, things like, you know, stress testing, etc. They'll want to see that. I think they haven't changed particularly. You know, their position, and they've been very sort of public around you know, the need for organisations to be viable, and in the times that we are in and have just gone and are going through now, I think that for them that is still where they, you know, concerned the risk, and, you know, they publish the sector risk profile, etc. But I wouldn't say there was, you know, any sort of one area in particular where I thought, you know, actually, you know, within the development of the code, there was, you know, a real focus from the regulator, they will probably you know, want to know that you're compliant with the whole thing if you've if it's your chosen code that you've adopted. Sorry, it's a bit of a non-answer, but
it's all right. In terms of you, I know we're sort of coming to an end now, but maybe quickly you can answer this one. In terms of your role as an audit and risk committee member, and obviously your knowledge of the code, what would you as a committee member expect to see from an assurance perspective from management and your internal audit team?
Oh, okay. I think probably, and I suppose again, every organisation is different. And you know, it will depend on the sort of your focus. I think in terms of what I'd expect to see from internal audit to aid with compliance is probably lots of what's already going on in the sort of best practice situations. You know, clear reports which you know, talk about, you know, the level of assurance that we have, you know, and highlight, you know, areas where we could do more. You know, always, I suppose, one of the things as an audit committee member, benchmarking against others is useful. You know, to understand, you know, how our organisation is doing compared to others. And I think that's sometimes where having a external internal auditor sometimes contributing can be useful, especially those who are familiar with the sector and could say, you know, yes, you're doing this in a very similar way to, you know, other organisations, or no, you're not. But in terms of, you know, as I say, we've got you know, an audit schedule which we agree, which, you know, everyone else will have. I think probably one of the things that we would do as a committee in the process of, you know, the organisation adopting this code would be to look at that audit schedule. And again, you know, I talked about the gap analysis. So, you know, we want to see that gap analysis and see, well, you know, what areas have we got where we potentially maybe aren't auditing this, we aren't looking at this enough, or we aren't looking at it in the way that's right, that's going to give us a suitable level of assurance that we are compliant with the provisions within the code. I think that's what I'd be doing, you know, with that hat on.
Okay. And in terms of the 2020 code, is there any time frame for reviewing it?
Oh, only just finished reviewing it.
I know, people are keen.
It's going to be looked at again. I think unless there's massive changes, we've roughly looked at the codes every 5 years, and you know, I'm not going to commit the Federation to say, well, you know, in 5 years' time there'll be a 2025 code, but certainly we aren't planning to do a similar approach to what the charities code's done, and do like an annual review and change it that much each you know, on an annual revision. So the code is, you know, set now, and it's what we're going to have for the next few years. You know, having said that, we always keep things under review. If there was, you know, suddenly a massive step change in, you know, what the sector, you know, I don't know, some sort of, you know, political changes that you know, change the nature of housing association fundamentally, you know, we'd obviously look at it again. But at the moment, we're not going to do anything this year. I think the next thing we're going to try and look at is the code of conduct that we sort of published, the template code of conduct, and you know, that came out as part of the process that maybe that needs to be refreshed for the because it was last published in 2012, needs to be refreshed for the social media age, etc.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Excellent. Well, I don't think there's any more questions coming through. I did have some more, but obviously we've run out of time, which is good that people were participating and joining in. So thank you very much for your time, Paul, and for sort of being honest and having those conversations with us. It's really useful. Just before we go, just wanted to sort of say, in terms of HIAF, we are working on future events and networking opportunities, which we'll share with you in due time. The Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors have also been engaged with myself and Angela, who's the other co-chair of HIAF, and so we're going to be trying to share different things with them, and they're going to be sort of telling us different documentations, guidance, and different publications that we might be able to participate in if they were to do things that are specific to housing associations. So all of that is still to come. And the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors website does have various different types of resources that are available that you can get if you're a member, and some that you can get as a non-member. So have a look on there as well. And I think that draws us to an end. And thank you everybody for joining us, and I hope you found it useful.
Yeah, thanks very much, Helen. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Everyone for coming along.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.